My name's Angela, and I'm here to talk to you today about the philosophical approach to creating more peace and justice based on modern research and ancient teachings. In 2015, the UN created 17 resolutions known as the Sustainable Development Goals to generate worldwide or universal peace and prosperity by 2030. We think two of those goals, which are peace and justice, are especially important for our world today. Now, since the dawn of civilization, since the dawn of time, human beings have been fighting for equality and freedom and peace. And there's a lot of ancient wisdom that we can pull from there that we can bring into the modern day to help us in that fight. And it's only going to be through cultivating something that's lasting, that's sustainable, that's going to generate that sustainable outcome of peace that we want to see in the world today. In order to get to peace, we need to start to heal division. And it was the Buddha actually that says things that can lend us a little bit of insight into how we can begin to approach this problem from a more internal perspective. One of the ways to begin this process of generating more of that peace is to look at our thoughts. The Buddha says, "They insulted me, they hurt me, they cheated me. In those who harbor such thoughts, hate will never cease." The Buddha then also says famously that only love can drive out hate. Hate does not drive out hate, only love can do that. And so before we can expect a better world outside, maybe we can start to look at our internal composition, the way that we're looking at these things within ourselves in order to generate that lasting harmony that we would like to see within the world today. So I'm excited to share with you today Brené Brown's research on connection, shame, and vulnerability, because we believe that it gives us some essential tools that we need to tackle this peace and justice initiative that we want to see in the world today. Now, most of you know Brené Brown already. She's an American researcher, storyteller who studies connection. She has a background in social work. But her studying of connection actually led her to study other areas such as shame, vulnerability, empathy, and something she calls wholehearted living. She started a national conversation, some would even say movement, around rethinking our connection to ourselves and to others. After reading her book on the power of vulnerability, I would highly recommend it for anyone who's looking to make a bigger impact. I think a lot of what her research uncovers could actually help a lot of social justice work to become even more efficient and effective than it is today, because it really strikes at the core of people and our want for connection and how that can bring us closer together. Now, there's a ton of research that Brené has done over the years, tons of books, tons of articles, wonderful TED Talks. But for the sake of this video, we're going to focus on just a few of the tools that she gives us. And then we're going to interweave that with some timeless wisdom that we see that she's dug out from this research, which I think is really interesting. And so the areas we're going to focus on today are: know thyself, why inner peace is essential to outer change; connection and shame, understanding the barriers to embodying peace; vulnerability, the peaceful response; empathy and braving the wilderness, how we can begin to heal ourselves and others. Let's get started. Know thyself. It should be noted that when we think of peace, what are we talking about here? Peace, when I think of peace, I think of harmony, lack of conflict, and the security and the freedom that comes from that harmony. But when we talk about how we can generate more peace, there's a quote from Einstein that comes to mind that I really love that says, "Peace cannot be kept by force. It can only be achieved by understanding." Let's unpack that. When Einstein says understanding, what does he mean? Well, he's not talking about a mathematical concept. He's talking about what within our very human nature is not peaceful. What is it within us that is generating this discord that we see outside of us? And how can we approach that and understand that better in order to look at those problems in a different way? Because we remember also too, Einstein also famously said, we can never solve problems with the same way of thinking that we had when we went into said problem. So to put things in philosophical terms, he's telling us to know thyself, know ourselves. So why is that? Well, if we're being totally honest, the only thing that we really have control over in this life is ourselves. What happens to us in any given moment might not necessarily be, well, more likely than not, isn't necessarily within our control, but how we respond to those things, how we can prepare for those things, and how we can move forward once these things happen to us is within our control. This is what we're talking about when we say, know thyself. Know what is within our control and how can I best manage myself, my expectations, my actions, my ways of doing things, thinking, to meet the world in that place, or just in the place that it exists today. Because when we know ourselves, we can work with ourselves, and we can even begin to go beyond ourselves. We can also, again, go beyond what it is that we think we are. All the things that we think make us who we are our looks, maybe we're dating, our job, and maybe who even were in the past. But philosophers from East and West, from all different points in history, from Plato to Buddha, talked about this idea that there is something within the human being, within people, that is transcendent, that goes beyond our physical reality, or that really sort of goes beyond or separates us apart from just nature. And that thing is free will. The fact that we can look into, say, the invisible, we can use our imagination to come up with, to create something in our minds and then generate it here in this world, speaks to that transcendent power. And the ancients believed that even though we're a part of nature, we have the ability to choose whatever it is that we do in any given moment. And that means that we can choose to work, say, with nature or against it. But the core, again, of this higher self, this true self, is to recognize our free will and to recognize our agency and our power to choose. And it's these things that we're going to need if we want to transform the world and make it into something better, to make it into something more peaceful and more just. Within this power to choose and this free will is incredible transformation abilities. Our responses to people can be more proactive than reactive. And again, when we're totally centered in that true self and that self that can regulate all of the wants and needs of these other parts of us, we can act truly independently from anything that's happening outside of us. When we're in that peaceful inner state, when our foundation is really in line with who we believe we are, and we're truly connected to what it is that we want to see out there in the world from that higher perspective, it's from that center that we realize everything else emanates from. And it's important to know that with that power of choice, each of us has the ability now to take in the pollution of the world, the ugly things and the mean things and the terrible things there, but transform it into something else. We look to nature. We see, say, the tree. Tree breathes in carbon dioxide that we are breathing out, the pollution in the air, and things like that, and it transforms it into oxygen, into the air that we breathe. And it's that inner transformation is something that we also have the power to wield. However, we are even more powerful in that sense because we have to consciously choose to do that thing. Now, how this manifests is that we can choose to forgive someone who wrongs us. We can choose to be compassionate to someone who we see suffering. We can choose to be empathetic, even if someone doesn't have our same beliefs or doesn't look like us. And we can choose to be generous with our time, money, energy, what have you, even if we think we don't have much to give. I think of a story of a social worker in New York City who gets off his train stop at the end of the night and is mugged at knife point by a teenager. It's cold out, it's the winter time, and the guy not only gives this kid his wallet, but he also gives him his coat. The kid's super confused, like, why are you doing this? And he says, well, you're willing to risk your freedom and safety because you don't know what I might have had on me for a couple bucks. You must be in a really tight spot. And you know what? If you're going to be going around mugging people in New York City tonight on this cold, winter, blustery night, why don't you take my coat? And it's interesting, right? Because that is not the response that you would typically get for something like that, or that you would expect there. But it's in this one-to-one human connection that this man was able to see this person in their suffering, really, and transform that situation into something better. It goes on to say that they later, went to a diner together and, had some kind of, peaceful conversation about, how it is that this, kid could potentially get out of this situation, especially running into a social worker, what better person to sort of, help them sort out those thoughts. And it's, again, this power to choose to do something different, to not just react to a situation, but to proactively choose our response to it, is what's illustrated in this story. But it first necessitates that we need to have that power to look at ourselves, our reasoning mind, our physical self, all these things in these moments, and recognize that we have a choice, and then to take that time to choose what's appropriate. Now, there are bigger problems happening in the story that led to this outcome of this, teenager mugging this guy, but the story is a great illustration of the fact that one-to-one human connection is really so powerful and has a powerful, again, ripple effect. The fact that we're, talking about on this video is proof to that. But it's that individual one-on-one human connection and that transformation in that moment is something that we all have power to do. It's not someone out there that can fix these problems. It's that we as individuals also have this power to make these changes. And they might be small at first, but again, we know when we see a ripple in a pond, the effect that it makes on the water. And to not discount that, to know that those choices are going to put something out there that we might not necessarily be able to even see the outcome of, but to act in each and every moment as if we could have that big of an impact, and to just see how we would respond to the world differently, just from that vantage point of having that higher perspective. Ultimately, when we are more peaceful, just, and harmonious within us, we're then now in the best position to bring out those qualities in other people. The saying, know thyself, it's often associated with Socrates, but it's written on the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. There's a second part of that phrase that not many people know. So it's know thyself, and you will know the gods in the universe. And so it's really this better understanding of ourselves, of our human nature, that we can use them from the launching point to understand the world better and to understand the problems that we're seeing, and maybe tackle them a little bit differently with this new heightened understanding. And it's this understanding that we need, that Einstein says, to cultivate peace. Which is why I'm so excited again to talk about Brené Brown, because her research really sheds a ton of light on what it is that we can do differently in order to connect with ourselves better, and then therefore bring that connection, that new connection and understanding we have of ourselves to the world, to these problems, to come up with better, sustainable solutions. It's the fact that we can choose to act differently is the first and most powerful step we can take towards better peace.
Connection and shame.
So Brené Brown's work utilizes grounded theory, which means that she studies the lived experiences of people across all walks of life. And through her years of using this method in her research and social work, now this is tons of interviews, thousands of data points that she's analyzed, she came up with one thing we can safely say drives us all, and it's a need for connection and belonging. She notes that we're wired for this biologically, and the data then shows that. But really what she's saying is that people view connection and belonging as essential to giving them a sense of joy and purpose in their lives. So Brené Brown defines shame as the fear that something we've done or failed to do, something about who we are or where we come from, has made us unlovable and unworthy of connection. Now, shame is there's something inherently bad about me, that if people see it, I will no longer be willing or no longer be worthy of this love and connection that I'm seeking. But this shame is at the core of the inequality that we're trying to fight in the world right now. And the core really of the division we see in this world, that she says this can be the biggest trap we fall into in our search for progress. And shame says that we're not enough, and it takes us away from our innate power of choice. It's shame that can trigger us to say or do things that aren't in line with our authentic self because we're afraid to be found out, so to speak. We're afraid to be judged and shamed further, or that we have no other choice but to be this way, but to be in shame. Brené made an interesting discovery when she looked at the differences between shame and guilt. Now, it's important to talk about the key differences here because guilt focuses on behavior. Guilt is, I did something bad. Shame focuses on who we are. It cuts to how we fundamentally view ourselves. It's, I am bad. Now, this is a key discovery of hers because we can see guilt as a good thing. Guilt actually acknowledges that we do have this fundamental part of us that is actually worthy of that connection, that higher self, what have you. And when we feel guilt, it's almost like we're like hitting the walls of, ooh, that was not something that I wanted to do, to be in alignment with that true self that I know that I am. And guilt can sort of help us to steer ourselves in the right direction if we screw up, so to speak, or we do something that doesn't necessarily make us feel good, because it's not who we truly are. It's not something that we would want to repeat. But shame cuts us off from any possibility of change because we feel as though we cannot be anything else, and that we're unworthy of achieving anything beyond what it is we are today, who it is we are now. So these two ideas recognize that change needs to happen from within. No external changes will affect how we view ourselves if we're in shame. We can still feel shame while racking up tons of accolades and awards and accomplishments and things like that. None of those external things are going to help us to get out of that feeling of shame that we have within. Now, guilt, believe it or not, is a motivator for change, right? It separates our sense of self-worth from the things that we do and allows us more agency to course correct or to address what it is we feel guilty about. Now, that small shift in thinking is the difference between suffering and moving closer to being who we truly are or achieving our truest potential. Now, the suffering that comes from shame and disconnection brings to mind something that the Buddha actually talks about in his core teaching. So the Buddha says that the source of all of our suffering is what he calls attachments, our desires, but really when you boil down to it, it's really ignorance of our true self. When we're essentially, so the illustration of this is that when we want something, we don't get it, we suffer. When we're ignorant of who we truly are and we act in a way that sort of punctures that part of us, then we suffer. When we're ignorant of our true self, of our higher self, and the fact that we really are worthy of connection, we really are worthy of the belonging that it is that we seek and that we know we can be a part of, that ignorance results in shame ultimately at our behavior and this disconnection. But it's that worthiness that we need to identify ourselves with, because it will act as a catalyst to pull us out of any situation or maybe behavior change that we want to accomplish. The Buddha also famously said, "We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world." And he even illustrates this further with an example. The thought manifests as the word. The word manifests as the deed. The deed develops into a habit. The habit hardens into a character. And so watch your thoughts and its ways with care, and let it spring from love, born out of concern for all human beings as the shadow follows the body. What we think, we become. So we see how easily in that quote that our thoughts and our behaviors can ripple out into the world. And Brené Brown saw a remedy in this that she talks about when she addresses shame in this quote. When it comes to shame, we have two options. We either walk into the stories of our lives and own them, or we view them from the outside and hustle for our worthiness. But our worthiness lives inside of our story. This is where know thyself comes back in. When we know our stories and know our true worthiness, really, we can choose to change our behavior. And we can also choose in these moments that we feel like we're in this shame spiral Brené talks about, to pull ourselves out of those things and to know that they're not true. When we're not acting from a place that honors our higher self, we're not engaging our full potential. And this is a huge problem because we need that true potential in order to cultivate this harmony and this peace that we want to see in the world. Brené warns, if we don't claim our shame, shame claims us. And really what she's trying to say is, by choosing to look at the stories that we tell ourselves and look at the ways that we think and evaluating those things from a different perspective, we can choose to think differently, and we can then start to heal the division, and then also start to look at the parts of ourselves that feel unworthy of that connection. When we look at our shame, when we acknowledge it, and when we choose to move past it, something else happens. We're able to go to a place of deep empathy. And from that space, we can begin to honor the inherent worthiness in others because we've done this hard work within ourselves. And now we have a duty to encourage others to see that true potential, that's just on the other side of their shame or these barriers that we face. And on the whole, when we begin to look at the world and all of its problems, we can better understand what those problems might be at the heart of really the human heart, at the heart of what makes us human. And when we can make solutions, or when we can think of solutions that honor that place, they will truly be sustainable and longer lasting, because those things within the human being also don't change. Vulnerability. An illustration of what moving past our shame looks like from Brené was exemplified in these people she found in her research called the wholehearted. Now, she found this subset of people in her research that seemed to surmount these life challenges a lot more easily than others and arrived at a place of joy, peace, love, deep empathy, and understanding. So Brené wondered, what do these people do differently? The number one thing that she found within these people when she interviewed them and went back into the data and looked at, again, what separated them from others was that they believed in their inherent worthiness. These people deeply believed in the fact that they were deserving of the love and connection that we all want in our lives, but that they sought those things and, again, kept in mind how much they deserved those things. They've kept in mind the fact that I am inherently worthy. And then that overflowed into also believing that others were inherently worthy of these things that they were also seeking. And each one of us has the power to live this way. Brené tells us that each person has access to this part of themselves. However, we have to choose to be this self. This choice isn't a one and done situation either. It's something that needs to be cultivated. It's helpful here to look at Brené Brown's definition of vulnerability. Vulnerability is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. But vulnerability is not weakness. It's our most accurate measure of courage. When the barrier is our belief about vulnerability, the question becomes, are we willing to show up and be seen when we can't control the outcome? So why are we talking about vulnerability now? Really what Brené found in her research is that the wholehearted inherently believed in their worthiness. And because of that, they were able to be in situations that might potentially put them in shame, or what we would perceive as shame, but it really just made them what she's calling vulnerable. That it put them in this state where, again, they can't control the outcome, but that they're expressing themselves with their whole hearts. And so that the people who lived wholeheartedly with their whole hearts believed that their vulnerability made them more beautiful. Now, the image that comes to me here is one of a flower. Now imagine a garden going through the different stages of life, so to speak. In times of growth during the summer or the springtime, when all of the outdoor conditions are to the best in the favor of the flower very easily sort of opens up and it exposes that inner core of itself. And this can be correlated to, say, golden eras in history. So things like the Italian Renaissance, when people were sort of in this environment that, brought out or sought to deeply understand what it is in the human heart that is universal. And so people you saw were sort of opening up their minds to these new ways of thinking. And it really was a great exercise, or it was a great outpouring of the height of human potential. We see things like, the Statue of David and, the Sistine Chapel being created. And that opening and stretching to the sky that we see in the flower was really sort of exemplified in the human being's potential sort of opening up. In this garden, we see when the temperature gets colder and when it becomes, sort of like the fall, winter time, we see this great struggle in that the flower starts to respond to the environment by closing and hiding and going into protective mode. This flower is us. Today, we see more and more people closing down their minds and their hearts because they see that maybe the outside environment doesn't exactly want to nourish what is essential within the human being. And time again, it's led to them feeling wounded and shamed and disconnected. But I think of someone like Viktor Frankl here. He was a psychotherapist who survived the concentration camps during Nazi-occupied Germany in World War II. And he would go on to usher in a new form of psychotherapy based on helping his patients find the meaning of their suffering or the meaning of their lives. And he has a great quote here that I'm going to read to you.
Between stimulus and response, there is space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. He reminds us that despite the external things that we might face in our environment, we have the ability to choose always. And to let ourselves be seen, to open up our minds to the possibility that, yes, maybe we are inherently worthy and that our vulnerability is what makes us authentic and more beautiful. To share that beauty, despite what the external world might say, is incredibly brave. And again, once we can go to that place when we are courageous enough to be vulnerable, when we look at the things that trigger us into shame, we can then go into, again, that deep place of empathy when we're feeling what others are feeling. And it's those things that are going to be essential to healing the division that we see in the world today. And it will also help us to look at others who are in this state of suffering now because we have this perspective of what we went through and be able to help them transform that. Viktor Frankl, again, once he chose to move beyond his suffering and his shame that he felt in the concentration camps, he actually found an incredible capacity within him to counsel and help the people around him. And this was potentially even the reason for his survival. He counseled other prisoners in the prison with him, the prison guards about their problems, even his own captors, he was able to go to a place of empathy with. And it's helping people find meaning in their suffering that, again, helped him survive this terrible experience, but then also helped all of us see that we have this inherent choice, no matter what the external environment is saying, to choose to be vulnerable, to choose to be authentic, to choose really to say, yes, I am inherently worthy of these things, despite everything to the contrary, maybe in my mind or in my environment telling me otherwise. So to sum things up, Brené says, empathy is not automatic. It's a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice. And so when we can be brave enough to cultivate empathy, we fuel further connection. And this means connection both with ourselves, with our true self, that higher self we talked about, and others. Braving the wilderness. Now, I could talk about Brené Brown all day, and she has so many books and wonderful pieces of content I would encourage you to read. But to sum up what we're talking about when we talked about connection, shame, vulnerability, wholeheartedness, all of this sort of is summed up in the concept of what she calls true belonging. Now, Brené felt like her definition of belonging was incomplete when she initially set off to publish a lot of her research here. And so she goes back to this definition in her latest book, Braving the Wilderness. I would highly recommend. And it speaks to the idea that we've touched on earlier, which is when we identify our sense of self with something outside of ourself. Brené's most recent definition of belonging is this: true belonging is the spiritual practice of believing in and belonging to yourself so deeply that you can share your most authentic self with the world and find sacredness in both being a part of something greater and standing alone in the wilderness. True belonging doesn't require you to change who you are. It requires you to be who you are. So belonging comes from being who we are, from going beyond our shame, and again, affirming that inherent worthiness we have within us, that higher self that Plato talks about. Not only that, it's about accepting this power we have to choose in every moment to be our true self. In order to be who we truly are, to truly belong to ourselves, we need first to choose ourselves, to choose to allow that self, that higher self, the true self that we know we have within us, to be the center of the world, to be the center on which we act on the world. Now, I love this paradox here that to achieve this sense of belonging that we all crave, we need to embrace what makes us unique, and while acknowledging our shared connection as human beings. Now, me being true to myself at any given moment might not be what your true self is, but even with all of our supposed differences in how we express ourselves, what we think, what our backgrounds might be, we share the fact that we are all human. Once we can get to a place where we feel this deeply, really what we're finding is that we don't need to take sides on issues anymore. Because we stand apart from all of the external debates and politics and camps that we see out there in the world,
we're connected to the part of us that sees beyond that, to that innate human quality that we all possess. And from this new perspective, we can empathize with all sides of an issue and start to see what's universal and what can be nourishing for everyone. We see this in what the Buddha calls the middle way. And it's interesting because the middle way is not in the middle of just two opposite sides like compromise. It's actually something that's elevated above what was previously those two sides, which is from a higher perspective, what is actually the issue that we're looking at and how can we solve that in a way that honors both sides of an issue. In this way of thinking, we honor the fact that all of us are human beings, all of our experiences are valid, and we can come to a place, because everyone is worthy of that love and connection, we can use that to pull ourselves into a place where we can see from a different vantage point all of these problems and find a better solution to them. And Brené Brown has a story of a quote from Maya Angelou that she had a really hard time coming to terms with, which is this: "You are only free when you realize you belong no place. You belong every place. No place at all. The price is high, the reward is great." Although we may be standing alone at times here, we're actually standing stronger. Any person in our lives, be it family or friends or members of whatever group we might be a part of, when they don't affirm what is true within us, that actually isn't the real belonging that we want. If they've shunned us because we chose to be authentic, then they were never going to be able to give us that true belonging and understanding and connection that we want. We need to feel confident and convinced that all that we are and all of what that looks like is inherently worthy, even if we're the only ones that get to see it. And when we're in this place, we find ourselves in a new foundation of strength that we can pull from by braving the wilderness and belonging to ourselves. Lastly, Viktor Frankl famously said, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." Conclusion. In this video, we talked about how Brené Brown helps us connect more deeply with ourselves and others, and how we can all move towards a more authentic, understanding place of peace. I hope you enjoyed this video talking about Brené Brown, about how we can come to a place of deeper connection and peace within ourselves. And to remember that if there's something that we haven't made peace with, we'll see it outside of ourselves before we can do that work within. If we want to create solutions that are truly sustainable, that stand the test of time, we need to address them from a place of understanding of the human being. Rather than reacting to some outside circumstance, we can be proactive in cultivating ourselves and our solutions based on the inherent need of all people, based on the universal human experience. The acceptance of our inherent worthiness, the understanding of the human condition, and the power of transformation that we have through our choices is key to creating lasting change that will result in peace. If we work to change the world based on what's timeless in the human being and really what's timeless about nature that we are a part of, these solutions will be lasting. I'll leave you with one of my favorite quotes from earlier, but put in a different context. "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." Martin Luther King Jr. With that, I hope that this video has helped just to give you a different perspective on how we can cultivate more internal peace, and hope to talk to you soon about our next video in the series. Thanks so much.